It wasn't the words King Charles used that unsettled the palace. It was what happened after. Minutes after the devastating health update was quietly delivered behind closed doors, Prince William reportedly abandoned scheduled commitments and returned at speed. Staff stopped speaking, corridors emptied, and for the first time in months, royal observers noticed something impossible to ignore. The future seemed to arrive all at once. 4 years, the monarchy had become almost synonymous with endurance. Public appearances continued. Statements remained measured. Schedules moved forward with practiced precision. Even through difficult periods, the message had always been the same: stability above all else. Which is why what reportedly unfolded behind closed doors sent such a wave through royal circles. According to reports and royal commentators closely watching palace movements, this was not treated as a routine health briefing. This was something quieter, more deliberate, and somehow more unsettling. Sources familiar with how royal operations are typically managed have suggested that the meeting involved only a tightly controlled group: King Charles, several senior advisors, and Prince William. That detail alone drew attention. Palace meetings happened constantly, but observers noted that the atmosphere surrounding this one appeared unusually contained. No advanced briefing, no carefully placed messaging, no visible attempt to soften speculation. Just silence. And silence in royal history has often spoken louder than announcements. Reports describing the king's health update did not focus solely on medical language. Instead, they pointed toward a broader shift in outlook. Those following the situation closely began noticing subtle changes in tone across official communications. Statements became shorter. Appearances became more selective. Language appeared increasingly careful. Not alarming, but undeniably restrained. Then came the detail that changed everything. William's decision to reportedly return immediately became impossible for royal observers to ignore. 4 years, the Prince of Wales has been viewed as disciplined and deliberate in public scheduling. Abrupt movements are rare. Sudden departures attract attention. Yet according to multiple reports and media discussions, plans were quietly adjusted with unusual speed. There were no dramatic announcements, no visible emergency. But the timing became the story. Why rush? That question spread quickly, because in institutions built on continuity, urgency itself becomes a message. Almost immediately, attention shifted beyond William and toward the wider family. Reports began circulating that Catherine had also altered family arrangements behind the scenes. Nothing publicly extraordinary. Nothing officially confirmed as connected. Yet royal followers noticed the pattern carefully. A check-in here, adjustments there, fewer signals, tighter control over appearances. It created an atmosphere that many described not as panic, but as preparation. And that distinction mattered. Preparation suggests planning. Planning suggests expectations. Meanwhile, media insiders began hinting that conversations around continuity and future responsibilities had quietly intensified over recent weeks, not because of a single moment, but because of a gradual realization that circumstances may no longer be operating on the original timeline. Publicly, everything remained calm. Privately, however, the questions appeared to be multiplying. Because if this had only been about treatment, reassurance likely would have followed. Instead, observers were left watching schedules, reading statements, and trying to interpret movements that suddenly felt heavier than before. And beneath all of it lingered one possibility that nobody seemed willing to say aloud. The urgency wasn't only about health. It was about what Charles may have decided to put into motion. Those present may never speak publicly, but according to royal watchers, this was not an ordinary family discussion. Something about the timing, the silence, and the expressions afterwards suggested decisions far larger than medical updates alone. By the time the doors closed, speculation had already begun. Not because anyone knew what had been said, but because of who was in the room, who was left outside it, and what happened afterward. Royal households are built on process. Meetings happen constantly. Briefings happen daily. Yet seasoned observers who follow the rhythms of the institution noticed something unusual almost immediately. This conversation appeared to exist outside the normal machinery. Reports suggest the exchange between King Charles and Prince William became the defining moment of the day, not because details emerged, but because details didn't. There were no reassuring leaks, no carefully balanced language designed to steady headlines, no familiar signals that everything remained unchanged. Instead, there was restraint. And restraint inside royal circles has often meant something more complicated than silence. According to commentators and longtime royal analysts, private father-son meetings inside the monarchy carry weight beyond family dynamics. They are rarely only personal. They become conversations about continuity, responsibility, timing, and preparation. Which is why attention began turning away from the health update itself and toward a more difficult question. Had the discussion shifted toward readiness, not succession in the dramatic sense that headlines often suggest, but readiness. Readiness to absorb more responsibility, readiness to carry more public weight, readiness to become the stabilizing center while uncertainty remained unresolved. And suddenly people started looking at William differently. Reports describing his appearance after the meeting did not focus on emotion alone. Observers repeatedly returned to one word: seriousness. Not shock, not fear. Seriousness. The kind that suggested a conversation had moved beyond possibilities and entered territory that demanded decisions. Royal history gives moments like this unusual gravity. Comparisons quietly surfaced not because circumstances were identical, but because transitions inside the crown have rarely announced themselves with declarations. They emerged through shifts in visibility, through altered schedules, through responsibilities redistributed one meeting at a time. Commentators referenced earlier generations, a young Charles preparing under Queen Elizabeth, the long apprenticeship that defined modern monarchy, the quiet transfer of expectation before any formal transfer of authority. But this felt different, because Charles was not stepping aside. He was still king, which meant any movement happening behind the scenes carried an entirely different emotional weight, a balancing act between continuity and preparation, between reassurance and reality. Meanwhile, palace operations appeared to continue normally on the surface. Engagements remained scheduled. Statements remained disciplined. Public language remained steady. Yet insiders and royal observers began suggesting subtle adjustments underneath that calm exterior. More coordination, more controlled messaging, greater emphasis on visibility where it mattered most. Nothing dramatic, everything deliberate. That contrast became impossible to ignore. Public calm, private urgency, the institution projecting co-confidence while quietly adapting. And perhaps that was the most revealing detail of all. Not that change had arrived, but that preparations may already have begun long before anyone realized. Royal households are built on routine, which is why insiders noticed immediately when routine disappeared. At first, nothing seemed dramatic enough to justify concern. There was no major announcement, no extraordinary statement, no sudden public address. The calendar still existed. Events still appeared. Official language remained careful and composed. But those who spend years watching the rhythm of royal life understood something had shifted almost immediately. Not because of what the palace revealed, but because of what quietly stopped happening. Routine inside the monarchy is more than scheduling. It is reassurance. It is structure. It is the institution demonstrating that regardless of pressure, regardless of headlines, the crown continues moving forward exactly as expected. And suddenly, the movement felt different. Observers began noticing subtle changes across public activity. Appearances appeared more selective. Timelines seemed tighter. Decisions that would normally unfold gradually now looked coordinated, deliberate, almost protected. There was no visible disruption. Yet the pattern itself became impossible to ignore. Reports started emerging that internal coordination had intensified. Nothing publicly dramatic, everything unusually precise. Royal commentators suggested strategic briefings may have quietly increased behind the scenes, not emergency sessions, but conversations focused on continuity, operational readiness, and protecting stability while uncertainty remained unresolved. That distinction mattered because continuity planning is not an admission of crisis. It is recognition that institutions survive by preparing before circumstances demand it. The palace, meanwhile, projected calm. Public messaging remained disciplined and measured. Language became remarkably careful, not overly optimistic, not alarming, simply restrained. Every sentence appeared designed to steady rather than explain. Every appearance seemed calibrated to preserve confidence. But restraint has a strange effect. The more controlled the message became, the more people searched for what was not being said. Even long-time royal observers noted another subtle shift. Behavior inside official circles reportedly became more disciplined than usual. There appeared to be less informal commentary, fewer peripheral signals, tighter consistency across communications. That kind of alignment rarely happens accidentally. It suggested focus, and focus suggested preparation. Yet amid all of these adjustments, one detail began attracting more attention than anything else. William, not through declarations, not through dramatic speeches, but through presence. Reports increasingly described him becoming more visible, not in a way that overshadowed Charles, but in a way that felt quietly intentional. More responsibility appearing around him. More attention settling naturally in his direction. More moments where observers noticed him occupying space that once seemed reserved for later. That was what made people uncomfortable, because nothing official had changed and yet something undeniably felt different. Royal transitions are rarely announced in real time. They reveal themselves in patterns, in altered expectations, in moments that seem ordinary until viewed together. One schedule adjustment means nothing. Several begin to tell a story. And suddenly every appearance, every statement, every movement started carrying a second layer of meaning. Not replacement, not transition, preparation. The palace never said it. William never suggested it. But speculation began building anyway, because when routine disappears inside the monarchy, people do not assume randomness. They assume history is beginning to move. For most of his adult life, William existed inside a strange contradiction. He carried enormous expectation while being expected to wait. His role demanded readiness without urgency, visibility without dominance, leadership without succession. The future belonged to him, but always somewhere far ahead. Until suddenly, it didn't. If the previous days had created questions around the palace, the effect on William became the story beneath the story. Observers were no longer simply watching a son supporting his father. They were watching someone increasingly positioned between two worlds, private family concern and constitutional obligation. And that balance is far more difficult than it appears, because monarchy does not pause for emotion. It absorbs it. Reports and commentary surrounding William's recent movements began describing a familiar tension, one that echoed through generations of royal history. Comparisons quietly emerged to Charles himself decades earlier, navigating years of preparation under Queen Elizabeth II. Long periods of waiting, long periods of standing beside history without stepping into it. But there was one difference commentators could not ignore. Charles prepared for a role that still seemed distant. William now appeared to be preparing while the future felt close enough to cast a shadow. That changes everything, because readiness sounds noble in theory. In practice, readiness means carrying responsibility before you officially inherit it. It means maintaining calm while privately confronting uncertainty. It means becoming stronger in public at the exact moment life becomes more fragile in private. And through all of this, William faced another challenge that royal history rarely acknowledges openly. He is not only an heir. He is a husband. He is a father. That human reality became increasingly difficult to separate from the constitutional one. Reports suggested family priorities had become more protected and more intentional. Observers noticed a quieter rhythm emerging around William and Catherine, not withdrawal, but careful preservation. Public expectations remained enormous. Yet there appeared to be equal determination to preserve normality wherever possible. Catherine's role drew particular attention, not because she became louder, but because she remained measured. There were no dramatic gestures, no visible attempts to redefine the moment. If anything, commentary suggested her presence became more deliberate through restraint itself, a stabilizing force during a period where symbolism suddenly mattered more than words. And perhaps that was what made the atmosphere feel heavier. Everyone seemed to understand the assignment. No one appeared willing to say it aloud. Because appearing too prepared raises questions. Appearing too emotional raises others. So the burden becomes impossible in its own way. Remain steady without appearing transitional. Lead without suggesting change. Support without overshadowing. That emotional cost rarely appears in official schedules. But people notice it anyway. And behind the controlled appearances and measured language, a deeper tension seemed to emerge. The conflict between legacy and personal responsibility. At what point does duty stop being preparation and become reality? At what point does protecting the institution begin reshaping the people inside it? As questions gathered around the palace and attention increasingly settled on Prince William, another pattern quietly emerged, one that had less to do with statements and more to do with restraint. Because while public conversation focused on readiness, continuity, and what the future might demand, Catherine seemed to move in the opposite direction, not toward explanation, not toward visibility, but toward steadiness. And that difference did not go unnoticed. Reports and commentary surrounding this period suggested something unusual had happened, not externally but emotionally. Observers began describing Catherine not as withdrawn but as focused. The distinction mattered. Because behind every constitutional conversation sits a reality that public narratives often overlook. There are children inside these moments. There are routines that still need protecting. There are ordinary conversations happening inside extraordinary circumstances. And if William's challenge appeared to be balancing duty and expectation, Catherine's role seemed to become balancing uncertainty and normality. Royal commentators began noting how discussions around George, Charlotte, and Louis quietly entered the wider conversation, not through official acknowledgement but through public curiosity. People wondered how much children understand during periods of transition. How families preserve ordinary life when extraordinary pressure surrounds them. But Catherine appeared determined not to let speculation define the atmosphere around them. That may have been why restraint became so noticeable. There were no dramatic attempts to reshape public attention. No visible effort to answer every rumor. No attempt to transform private concern into public narrative. Instead, reports suggested an emphasis on continuity. Familiar routines, stability where possible, protecting space before protecting image. And perhaps that was what resonated most strongly, because calm can sometimes feel more powerful than explanation. Yet calm also carries a cost. Public appearances during uncertain periods become unusually difficult. People stop watching events and start searching for meaning. They analyze timing, expressions, decisions, presence, absence. Observers began interpreting Catherine's appearances through an entirely different lens, not asking what she was doing, but what she might be carrying quietly while doing it. That pressure creates a strange contradiction. The calmer someone appears, the more people assume they know something. The quieter someone becomes, the louder speculation grows. And still, she remained measured. Not because uncertainty disappeared, but perhaps because stability had become part of the responsibility. There was something almost symbolic in that approach. While questions expanded outward, her posture appeared to narrow inward toward family, toward routine, toward preserving a sense that not everything had to change at once. Because monarchy speaks in symbols, but families survive through habits. And in moments like these, those two realities rarely exist separately. Still, beyond emotion and headlines stood something even larger than any individual. The monarchy was designed to survive moments exactly like this, even when the people inside it are not ready. That may be the most difficult truth at the center of every royal era. Long before modern headlines, before cameras, before statements crafted down to the final word, the institution was built around a single idea. Individuals may struggle, but the crown continues. Kings age, circumstances change, private uncertainty arrives without permission. Yet the system itself is designed to absorb instability and transform it into continuity. Which is why periods like this create such a strange tension. Publicly, people look for emotion. Historically, the monarchy prepares for endurance. Royal historians have often pointed out that some of the most significant transitions in modern monarchy never began with declarations. They began with adjustments, responsibilities redistributed, appearances reshaped, expectations changing before titles ever did. That pattern has repeated across generations. Periods of illness, uncertainty, and changing circumstances have historically forced the institution to do something uncomfortable, maintain the appearance of permanence while privately adapting to reality. And that adaptation is rarely dramatic. It unfolds. That may explain why recent discussions appeared increasingly centered on stability rather than explanation. Public messaging remained consistent. Reassurance remained central. The language surrounding duty, service, and continuity appeared more important than ever. Not because uncertainty had disappeared, but because uncertainty cannot be allowed to become the defining story. That contrast has always existed inside monarchy. Public duty, private fear, one visible, one rarely acknowledged. Because behind official appearances are still families having difficult conversations, weighing possibilities they never wanted to confront, and managing emotions that cannot become public responsibilities. Yet the institution asks something extraordinary of them: continue. That expectation carries enormous weight. And perhaps that is why observers increasingly began discussing not just the present moment but the shape of what comes after it. Not succession as an event, but succession as a process. Because preparation itself carries symbolism. When more responsibility appears around one generation, attention naturally shifts toward the next. Not because anyone declares it, not because anyone announces it, but because institutions communicate through patterns long before they communicate through language. That possibility created mixed emotions. There is comfort in continuity. There is sadness in recognizing why continuity becomes necessary. And perhaps that is why moments like this feel so emotionally complicated. They ask people to hold two ideas at once: hope for the present and preparation for the future. Neither replaces the other. They exist together, which returns to the lesson history seems to repeat again and again. Transitions inside monarchy are almost never announced in the moment people expect. They emerge gradually, quietly, through changed rhythms, through shifting roles, through ordinary moments that only later reveal themselves as turning points. Not every turning point announces itself. Some arrive disguised as a schedule change, a delayed appearance, or a quiet drive back to the palace. By this stage, the conversation had become larger than updates, appearances, or speculation. The details people searched for most were still unavailable. Yet the emotional shape of the moment had already become visible. Not through declarations, not through dramatic announcements, but through adjustment, through the unmistakable feeling that everyone involved understood something important had shifted, even if nobody intended to define it publicly. And at the center of that feeling stood King Charles. For decades, his public story was one of waiting. A life lived close to responsibility, but never fully inside it until later than anyone expected. He inherited not only a title but expectations shaped across generations. Then came a reign defined by transition, pressure, scrutiny, and the difficult task of leading an institution while the world around it changed faster than tradition usually allows. That context made this moment feel different, because regardless of headlines or public debate, people recognize something deeply human beneath the symbolism. No reign unfolds exactly as imagined. Every leader eventually meets circumstances they cannot schedule, negotiate, or delay. And perhaps that was what gave the recent atmosphere its emotional weight. Not fear alone, but perspective. Observers began reflecting less on what Charles might do next, and more on what his years had represented. Continuity through change, duty through uncertainty, persistence through periods that demanded adaptation. At the same time, attention naturally moved toward William, not as replacement, not as conclusion, but as continuation. That distinction became increasingly important. Over the course of these discussions, William's position appeared to evolve in public perception. Earlier conversations focused on preparation, then responsibility. Now, something subtler emerged, a growing recognition that leadership sometimes arrives quietly, long before anyone formally acknowledges it. Yet what seemed to resonate most strongly was not the idea of one person stepping forward. It was the image of a family staying connected while carrying different burdens at the same time. A father continuing, a son preparing, a family protecting normality where possible. Observers often talk about continuity as though it is procedural. But moments like this suggest continuity may actually be emotional. It is built through people deciding again and again to move forward even when certainty becomes impossible. And perhaps that became the final thread connecting everything. Legacy not as memory, but legacy as responsibility, legacy as something living. Because institutions do not endure through documents alone. They endure because each generation decides to carry what came before while accepting that they cannot control what comes next. That realization can feel heavy. But it can also feel reassuring, because the story was never really about one meeting, one statement, or one difficult season. It was about what happens afterward, how people respond, how families adapt, how duty changes shape without disappearing. And in the end, maybe that was the message people had been searching for all along. Not certainty, not prediction, but endurance. Because in moments like these, the monarchy reveals what it has always claimed to be, not a single person, but a promise carried forward.